He rang all the taxis that had been to Paddington and to his hotel, the staff and the guests. It's a huge number of people.
To contain the virus, the authorities had to locate everyone at risk, vaccinate them within 4 days.
That the New York outbreak is smallpox. This
Within 24 hours, 38 new cases were confirmed in New York, plus 6 further cases in 3 other countries.
New York City is reeling this morning after confirmation of an outbreak of smallpox. People on the streets are taking whatever precautions they can, but the mood of New Yorkers is clearly fearful.
As the anxiety of New Yorkers grew, the city's hospitals were becoming overwhelmed.
Well, the irony is that we had ordered enough vaccine after September the 11th to vaccinate every man, woman, and child in the United States, but that was not due for delivery until the end of 2002. Now, we had some test batches which were not proven in their efficacy, and we could push delivery as fast as we possibly could, but even then we would not be getting the quantities of vaccine that we needed for several weeks. And so we had to use our existing stockpile of vaccine, which was at best. Well, the irony is that we had ordered enough vaccine after September the 11th to vaccinate every man, woman, and child in the United States, but that was not due for delivery until the end of 2002. Now, we had some test batches which were not proven in their efficacy, and we could push delivery as fast as we possibly could, but even then we would not be getting the quantities of vaccine that we needed for several weeks. And so we had to use our existing stockpile of vaccine, which was at best 15 million doses, as wisely as we possibly could.
Just put some solution on your skin.
So we had to make every dose count. We had to focus the use of this vaccine on people who are most at risk. That meant hospital workers, and paramedics, and only those contacts that had a face-to-face contact with a known case. No friends, no relatives.
But Jack Hill believed holding back vaccine was a mistake, and that mass vaccination of New York should begin immediately.
To not vaccinate the city means that you would have a lot of people very pissed off about the fact that they weren't being protected. And this means the bus drivers, the subway drivers, the ambulance drivers, anybody that supports the infrastructure of the city. If they're not vaccinated, how are they going to know that they're safe to do their job? How are they going to know that their family is safe when they come home? So it's not a matter of just medical necessity, it's human necessity.
But the CDC would not authorize a wider vaccination program in New York. Their fear was that the epidemic had been started deliberately. No one knew which city might be targeted next.
From the moment Jack Hill phoned, we suspected that it was a deliberate release. And as soon as we had established that there were no reports of an accident in a lab, I had no doubt in my mind that the city was under attack.
My fellow Americans, we have reason to believe that the outbreak of smallpox in New York is an act of terrorism on the American people. The highest priority of this administration is to find and prosecute these criminals and prevent any further outbreaks. Have no doubt the full force of retribution will be brought to bear on the perpetrators of this evil crime and its sponsors. God bless America.
Well, the obvious place to point the finger is the Middle East, of course. But then you have to set back. You have to look again, because Islam does not have the monopoly on fanaticism. Look at the group in Japan, the release of sarin gas in the Tokyo subways of 1995.
But 3 days after the first case was diagnosed, there were still no clues as to who had unleashed the virus or why?
There was no common thread that tied the early cases together. They were all over the city, different occupations, different sexes, different ages, all of the epidemiologic features that we look at usually. There was nothing.
But on day 4, the investigation made its first breakthrough. The CDC in Atlanta identified the strain of smallpox as India 1.
This proved that the virus originated in a Russian bioweapons lab and then somehow found its way into the hands of terrorists.
In the 1960s, the Soviet Union was one of the driving nations behind the campaign to eradicate smallpox. But this was at the height of the Cold War. Unwittingly, many of the Soviet doctors were sending smallpox samples back to the Russian military. To the generals, the eradication of the disease presented a unique opportunity.
If there is no smallpox, it means nobody would be vaccinated anymore. If nobody is vaccinated, a new biological weapon based on smallpox would be the most powerful and effective weapon ever created to eliminate human life.
In the 1980s, Dr. Ken Alibek held the rank of colonel in the Soviet Army. His job to oversee the secret development of a massive bioweapons program using a specially selected strain of smallpox.
The major strain used in the Soviet Union had a code name India 1. It was a highly virulent, highly contagious agent, and it was not very difficult to adopt this strain for existing technological processes.
Although it was consistently denied to the West, Biopreparat, the Soviet biological weapons program, was producing deadly diseases on an industrial scale. Inside these laboratories, Ebola, tularemia, anthrax, and smallpox were all weaponized. They were then loaded into missiles to be unleashed on the West in the event of total war.
We call biological weapons weapons of mass destruction. It's a very significant mistake. Biological weapons are not weapons of mass destruction. Biological weapons are mass casualty weapons. Biological weapons don't destroy non-living entities. They just infect and kill people.
It wasn't until 1992, when Ken Alibek defected to America, that the full scale of the Soviet biological weapons program became apparent.
The size and scope of the research and development program was enormous. Upwards of 60,000 people worked in Biopreparat alone. Large numbers of experts in every aspect of the biological sciences and microbiology and the like. Almost really the flower of a generation of the most clever people. In some instances, ended up in the program.
In the 80s and 90s, hundreds of tons of smallpox were stockpiled in Soviet laboratories. Real concerns existed over the security of these facilities.
With the breakup of the Soviet Union, the support to the laboratories where the virus was being made diminished sharply, and between a third and a half of all the scientists left the laboratories to go to many places. And let us face it, these are scientists with families and what have you, and no money. And so you could certainly hire these people as consultants very easily at very low prices, and many countries did.
By April the 18th, new outbreaks were confirmed in the densely populated cities of Delhi, Tokyo, Karachi, and Moscow.
Meanwhile, Bangladesh is one of a growing...
Other nations took action to try to prevent the further spread of the disease to their shores.
Passengers arriving from Calcutta were stopped at Dhaka Airport.
French nationals are still being allowed off ships. They face a possible 17-day quarantine. And as from tomorrow, all Eurotunnel and ferry services between France and England will be suspended until the epidemic in the UK.
In London, the authorities were also beginning to count the cost of Mark Smith's legacy.
We vaccinated more than 4,000, and still it slipped through the nets. It's an elusive disease.
As the United Kingdom's smallpox epidemic continues to escalate, hospitals...
By day 11, outbreaks were confirmed in Glasgow, Manchester, Bristol and Birmingham. Command of the crisis in London was now in the hands of Chief Superintendent Clive McAdams.
At this stage, the Department of Health don't feel it's necessary to mass vaccinate. But I will say that as we speak, vaccination is going on.
A decision had been made to withhold information about the size of the UK vaccine stockpile.
Yes, sir?
Chief Superintendent, could you respond to recent rumours in the press that there's not enough vaccine in the country to contain the epidemic?
Now, we have a perfectly adequate stockpile of vaccines to contain and control this epidemic.
But can you confirm what the actual figure is?
I'm sure you'll appreciate that it's a matter of national security. I'm not at liberty to discuss the actual figure. Suffice to say that we have enough to meet all anticipated demands. There was roughly 14 million doses of vaccine. We weren't sure about that figure. That was the other thing. We weren't actually sure. It was a vague figure, but even so, 14 million vaccine. There are 60 million people. They say that we have enough to meet all anticipated demands. There was roughly 14 million doses of vaccine. We weren't sure about that figure. That was the other thing. We weren't actually sure. It was a vague figure, but even so, 14 million vaccine. There are 60 million people in the UK. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that only a quarter of the UK are going to be vaccinated. And if that information had got out, it would have led to, well, mass panic.
But by refusing to go public with the figures, it appeared the government had something to hide.
The press immediately became suspicious. They published inaccurate information. And just when we needed the public most, they started to disbelieve what we had to tell them. Once the public had seen those figures, there was a kind of domino effect of panic. And we lost control.
Despite the Department of Health's insistence that there's no significant risk to hauliers, the Transport and General Workers Union is supporting its drivers' demands for vaccine.
To me, it's pathetic, really, because we're driving all over the country and I haven't been vaccinated at all. And to be honest, I'm going back home now because I don't want to spread the disease around my area, around my family.
With almost no trucks delivering, panic buying led to food and fuel shortages. Within days, London transport workers joined the protest, refusing to work unless they too received vaccine.
You know, the epidemiologists couldn't get fuel for their cars. The environmental health workers who were my foot soldiers going around inoculating people couldn't get there. It was an absolute disaster.
With the UK's infrastructure unravelling, the authorities were rapidly losing their grip on the epidemic.
I'm at home, I'm doing nothing, I'm out of school, so I decided to keep a video diary of the point of view of me and my family, how it's going to affect us.
Hello.
Yeah, Mum.
Yes, what are you doing? Sean and Trish and I lived in a council flat.
Trisha? Morning, Trish.
In an estate in South London.
What are you doing on the computer, Mum?
I'm checking emails right now. I really did try to get Sean and Trish to stay indoors.
How are you today, Trish?
Sean, piss off.
That's a good mood then.
Sean. All the news reports coming out were advising people to stay put, to try not to travel, etc. We had already decided that prior to the authorities giving this kind of blanket advice. It just seemed like the right thing to do.
What an effect of panic, everyone's buying stuff.
we talked round in circles about what if we went to the country, what if we... there was nowhere that we could think of that was safe. There was absolutely nowhere.
This morning, Long Island College Hospital in Brooklyn announced that Cynthia Sheldon, America's first smallpox victim, has died.
As fear turned to panic, tens of thousands of New Yorkers began to flee the city. But by now, outbreaks were occurring all over the USA. Suddenly, every state was clamoring for vaccine.
You were lucky if you got 100 out of the vial that they gave you. If you don't hold the vial upright, if you hold it sideways, the drops that you get on the needle will be bigger and you'll be wasting doses. If you puncture the skin too abruptly or too deeply and you draw too much blood, you'll be washing away a vaccine. So then you have to do it again. So even though it says 100 on this vial, you know, you're lucky if you get half of 100.
You suffer from hepatitis A?
No.
Hepatitis B?
No.
Even where vaccine was available, for many it had serious side effects. Pregnant women, anyone with a chronic skin condition, or an immune deficiency disease like AIDS couldn't take the vaccine. In many cases, it could kill them. Sam Wiseman, who suffered from eczema, was among this group.
Well, there's a preparation called vaccinia immune globulin, or VIG, which is antibodies taken from the serum of people who have been vaccinated and given to people like me who can't take the vaccine. It's a very effective, if painful, series of intramuscular injections taken over 2 days. And there are only 700 courses of this available in the United States. And I must say I felt very awkward, at least, using it for myself when hundreds of thousands of others didn't have access to it. Or I could use it to protect my daughter, which is what I did.
We decided we had to create special hospitals. And we took the armories throughout the city and the boroughs, and we turned them into the smallpox hospitals.
Thousands of beds were set up inside each building in preparation for the anticipated cases. The hospitals were manned by volunteer health workers, and the National Guard was posted on the perimeter to prevent anyone getting out. By April 29th, 100 people had died. Each body was still infectious, making it impossible to return the victims to their families.
As the dead increased, it became apparent that we weren't going to be able to deal with it in the conventional manner in the city morgues. So we decided to take over Governor's Island and turn it into a morgue. And we took Army-issue air-conditioned tents, and every morning when the bodies were collected from the hospitals, they were taken to Governor's Island and laid out. And we filled one tent, and then we filled another tent, and we filled another tent, and that's what we did with the dead.
As more and more people avoided coming into the city, the world's greatest financial district fell silent. In just over 2 weeks, New York had ground to a halt. By day 16, there were still no clues as to who had unleashed the virus. But the date of the attack had been pinpointed, April 1st, 2002.
A pattern started to emerge that was fairly clear. Amongst the early cases, there were two groups. The first group had traveled on the subway between Wall Street and Grand Central between 7:30 and 8:30 in the morning. The second group were in or around Penn Station between 8:30 and 9:30. So clearly, and without a doubt, the killer had targeted these sections of the city.
Yeah, we pulled thousands of hours of CCTV footage from every bank, building,